The afternoon sun beat down on Jim's back as he adjusted the final connection on his rainwater collection system. He stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead, and smiled at his handiwork. 6 large blue barrels lined the side of his modest, ranch-style home, connected by a network of PVC pipes that led from his gutters. It wasn't fancy, but it was his, and he felt a rush of pride looking at it. Living in a place where water restrictions were as common as bad traffic, Jim had spent countless hours researching how to build this setup. 3 weekends of hard work, 2 trips to the hardware store, and 1 very patient buddy holding the ladder had finally paid off. His garden would survive the summer without driving his water bill through the roof. "That's quite a setup you've got there," called Mrs. Rodriguez from next door. She was watering her potted plants, carefully measuring each pour from her watering can. "Thanks. Want me to help you build one too?" Jim offered, always happy to share his projects. "I would, but you know how the neighborhood rules are," she said, with a shrug. "I don't want to rock the boat." Jim nodded, understanding her concerns. Their neighborhood, Sunset Meadows, had rules about everything from fence height to what color you could paint your mailbox, but he'd checked before starting his project. Nothing in the thick binder of homeowners association rules said anything about rainwater collection. He'd made sure of it. For the next 2 years, Jim's system worked beautifully. During the rainy spring months, he collected enough water to keep his vegetable garden thriving even through the driest parts of summer. His tomatoes grew plump and juicy, his peppers flourished, and the zucchini threatened to take over the whole backyard. He shared his bounty with neighbors, who started calling him Garden Guy and asking for growing tips. "It's mostly the rainwater," he'd explain, showing them how his simple irrigation lines led from the collection barrels to different sections of the garden. Plants seemed to love it more than the treated stuff from the tap. Some neighbors even took pictures, wanting to copy his setup. Jim was always happy to help, sketching out plans and making supply lists for anyone interested. It felt good to be useful, to share knowledge that helped others save money and resources. Then everything changed when Sunset Meadows HOA elected a new board president. The morning had started like any other. Jim was up early, coffee in hand, checking his plants before the day got too hot. The recent rain had filled his barrels to the brim, and he was adjusting the slow drip system to his cucumber row when he heard someone clear their throat loudly. He turned to find 3 people standing at his fence gate. At the center stood a woman with perfectly styled hair, designer sunglasses perched on her head, and a clipboard hugged tightly to her chest. On either side of her were 2 men in polo shirts with the HOA logo, looking uncomfortable but trying to appear official. "Good morning," Jim said, setting down his coffee mug on the garden bench. "Can I help you folks?" "Mr. Peterson," the woman said without returning his greeting. "I'm Debbie Wilkins, the new president of Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association." She didn't offer her hand, just tapped her pen against the clipboard. "We're conducting property inspections today." "On a Saturday morning?" Jim asked, glancing at his watch. It wasn't even 8 a.m. yet. "We find violations are most visible in the morning light," Debbie replied with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Speaking of violations, we need to discuss your—" She waved her pen dismissively at his rainwater system. "Unauthorized external fixtures." Jim frowned, confused. "Unauthorized? I checked the guidelines before I built this. There's nothing in there about rainwater collection." Debbie's smile grew tighter. "Perhaps you haven't received the updated guidelines. Section 8.3 was amended last month. All external water collection systems must be approved by the Architectural Committee." She thrust a piece of paper through the fence slats. "You have until Friday to remove this eyesore, or you'll face daily fines." Jim took the paper, reading it quickly. The language was vague, but it did indeed prohibit unauthorized water diversion systems visible from any public or common space. His heart sank. "This doesn't make any sense. My system has been here for 2 years without any problems. Nobody complained before." "Well," Debbie said with a slight shrug, "I'm complaining now, and as board president, my job is to enforce our community standards." She looked pointedly at his garden, Some might find your setup industrially unappealing. As they walked away, Jim stood in his garden, notification in hand, watching the water slowly drip from his carefully designed system onto his thriving plants. Something didn't add up, and he wasn't going to dismantle 2 years of work without a fight. Jim spent the rest of the weekend in a daze, moving between anger and disbelief. He pulled out his copy of the HOA guidelines, flipping through the dog-eared pages until he found the section on external fixtures. Nothing about rainwater collection. He even checked the online version on the neighborhood website, but it hadn't been updated in months. Monday morning, he called in late to work and drove to the HOA office, a small building at the entrance of their neighborhood. The office was only open 3 days a week, and today was one of those days. As he pulled into the parking lot, something caught his eye. Behind the building, partially hidden by decorative shrubs, were several large green tanks. They looked suspiciously like industrial-sized versions of his own rainwater barrels. "Can I help you?" asked a bored-looking man at the front desk when Jim walked in. "Yes, I'm Jim Peterson from Maple Street. I got this notice about my rainwater collection system," Jim said, sliding the paper across the counter. "I'd like to see the updated guidelines that were mentioned." The man barely glanced at the notice. "You'll need to make an appointment with Mrs. Wilkins to discuss violations." "I don't want to discuss it yet. I just want to see the actual written rule," Jim insisted. After some back and forth, the man reluctantly printed out a single page with the new Section 8.3 guidelines. The amendment had indeed been passed, but the date showed it had only happened 2 weeks ago, not last month as Debbie had claimed. "When were homeowners notified about this change?" Jim asked. "Letters were sent out," the man replied, not looking up from his computer. "I never got one," Jim said. "Must have gotten lost in the mail," came the unhelpful response. On his way out, Jim decided to take a closer look at those tanks behind the building. Keeping his movements casual, as if he were just admiring the landscaping, he walked around the bow side of the building. What he saw made his jaw drop. It wasn't just a few tanks. It was an elaborate system, much larger than his own, with what looked like drainage pipes leading from several streets in the neighborhood. One of the pipes had a label from Jim's own street. As he stood there putting the pieces together, a maintenance worker emerged from the back door. "Morning." Jim nodded, trying to act normal. "That's quite a setup you've got here." The worker, a middle-aged man with a kind face, looked at the tanks and shrugged. "Yeah, I got it installed last month. Mrs. Wilkins had it rushed through. Says it's saving the HOA money on watering all these fancy gardens she's putting in." Jim looked around at the elaborate flower beds and water features surrounding the office building. "Fancy is right. Must take a lot of water to maintain all this." "You bet. Especially with the water restrictions coming. But we'll be fine with this system. Collects from half the neighborhood." Jim felt his blood pressure rising. "Half the neighborhood, like it collects water that would normally go to people's homes?" The worker looked uncomfortable, suddenly realizing he might have said too much. "I just maintain it, sir. Don't know all the details." Jim thanked him and walked back to his car, mind racing. So that was it. The HOA, or more specifically Debbie Wilkins, had installed their own massive rainwater collection system, diverting water that would naturally flow to the homes on his street. And now they were telling him his small system was against the rules? At home, Jim pulled out his old college engineering textbooks and spent the evening refreshing his memory on drainage, patterns, and water flow. He sketched a rough map of the neighborhood marking the natural slope of the land. His house sat on a slight hill, with natural drainage flowing toward the back of his property and then down toward where the HOA office was located at the neighborhood entrance. He took a walk around the block, paying close attention to the storm, drains, and how they connected. Near the corner of his street, he noticed something odd. A new drainage pipe had been installed, redirecting water that would normally flow down the natural creek bed behind his house. Following the pipe's direction, he realized it led straight to the HOA office. The next day, Jim called an old college buddy who worked for the city's water department. "Hey, Tom, it's Jim. I've got a weird question about rainwater rights in residential areas." After a long conversation with his friend, Jim had confirmed his suspicions. What the HOA was doing wasn't just unfair, it was potentially illegal. In their state, homeowners had reasonable rights to rainwater that fell on their property. The HOA couldn't just redirect natural drainage without proper permits and homeowner consent. Armed with this knowledge, Jim decided to go through proper channels. He made an appointment to meet with Debbie Wilkins, prepared his case with photos and documentation, and even printed out the relevant local water rights laws. The color drained from Debbie's face as Jim placed photos of the HOA's water collection system on her desk. For a moment, she was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then, just as quickly, she regained her composure. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, Mr. Peterson, but our system is completely different from yours. Ours is professionally installed and benefits the entire community. By stealing water that should be flowing to my property and my neighbors' properties," Jim asked, keeping his voice steady despite his rising anger, "and then using that water for your landscaping business?" Debbie's eyes narrowed. "My business won the HOA landscaping contract fair and square long before I became board president. But now that you are president, you've pushed through rules that benefit your business while hurting homeowners like me," Jim countered. "I've spoken with the city water department. What you're doing might not even be legal without proper permits and homeowner consent." Debbie stood up, her hands flat on the desk. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Peterson?" "I'm just stating facts. I want to keep my rainwater system. It's been there for 2 years without complaints. It doesn't hurt anyone, and it helps me conserve water. Meanwhile, you're taking water that would naturally flow to our properties." "The board has already voted on the new guidelines," Debbie said firmly. "Your appeal is denied before you even make it. Remove your system by tomorrow, or the fines begin." Jim left the office feeling defeated but more determined than ever. That evening, he called his neighbors and explained what he'd discovered. Many were shocked, especially those who had noticed changes in drainage around their homes since the HOA system had been installed. "We should all go to the next board meeting," suggested Mr. Chen from across the street. "They can't ignore all of us." The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Jim spent the weekend gathering more evidence, taking photos of the HOA system, and making diagrams showing how the water was being diverted. He also reluctantly dismantled most of his visible rainwater collection system to avoid the fines, storing the pieces in his garage. His garden would suffer, but he hoped it would only be temporary. Tuesday evening arrived, and Jim was heartened to see a much larger crowd than usual at the HOA meeting. At least 20 of his neighbors had shown up, many of them clutching notes or looking determined. Debbie seemed surprised by the turnout, but called the meeting to order with her usual brisk efficiency. When it was time for homeowner comments, Jim was the first to raise his hand. He presented his findings clearly, showing his photos and explaining how the HOA's water collection system was affecting homes throughout the neighborhood. "Many of us didn't even know this system existed until recently," he explained. "We weren't consulted, and now you're telling us we can't have our own small-scale systems while you're operating this massive one that takes water that would naturally flow to our properties." Several neighbors spoke up in support, describing changes they'd noticed in drainage around their homes. Mrs. Rodriguez talked about how her basement had started getting damp after heavy rains since the HOA system was installed. Mr. Chen mentioned the growing puddles in his backyard where water used to flow naturally downhill. Jim watched the other board members as his neighbors spoke. A couple looked uncomfortable, glancing at each other with concern. But Debbie remained unmoved, her face a mask of professional detachment. When everyone had spoken, Debbie cleared her throat. "While we appreciate your concerns, the board has already approved both our water conservation system and the new guidelines regarding private systems. Section 8.3 clearly states," "But that rule was only added 2 weeks ago," interrupted Mrs. Rodriguez, usually so quiet at these meetings. "After your system was already built." "The timing is irrelevant," said Debbie. "As board president, I have to enforce our guidelines. They apply to everyone equally." "Except the HOA itself, apparently," muttered Mr. Chen. Debbie ignored him. "I'll put it to a vote. All in favor of upholding the new guidelines and requiring Mr. Peterson to permanently remove his unauthorized water collection system?" Jim watched in dismay as each board member raised their hand, some more reluctantly than others. The vote was unanimous. Additionally, Debbie continued with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, since we've received multiple complaints about this issue, the board has decided to increase the fine for non-compliance to $100 per day, effective immediately. The room erupted in protests, but Debbie banged her gavel repeatedly until everyone quieted down. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced. "Mr. Peterson, I expect your property to be in compliance by the end of the week." As people filed out of the room, several neighbors patted Jim on the shoulder or whispered words of encouragement. But he barely noticed. He was staring at Debbie, who was gathering her papers with a satisfied smile, not even bothering to look at the homeowner she was supposed to represent. Something hardened inside him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jim woke up early the next morning, his mind still spinning with thoughts from the meeting. He'd barely slept, anger and frustration keeping him awake for hours. He made a cup of coffee and stepped outside to check on his garden, a habit he couldn't break even though his watering system was now dismantled. The plants were already starting to look stressed without their regular water supply. His prized tomato plants drooped in the morning sun, their leaves curling slightly at the edges. It broke his heart to see them suffering after he'd tended them so carefully. As he was examining the damage, his phone rang. It was Tom from the water department. "Hey Jim, I looked into that situation you mentioned. It's definitely in a gray area legally. They should have filed for drainage modification permits, which it doesn't look like they did. But here's the thing. Even if they did everything wrong, fighting the HOA could take months or even years in court." Jim sighed. "That's what I was afraid of. Thanks for checking." He hung up and sat on his garden bench, feeling defeated. The law might be on his side, but Debbie had the power of the HOA board behind her, and fighting would cost time and money he didn't have. His garden would be dead long before any legal battle could be resolved. As he sat there, he noticed water trickling from a downspout where one of his collection barrels used to be. It flowed across his yard and disappeared under the fence, eventually making its way downhill toward, he suddenly realized, the HOA office. His engineering mind began working, picturing the natural flow of water during a heavy rain. Jim spent the rest of the day checking the HOA guidelines word by word. There were rules about drainage, but nothing that said he couldn't modify the flow of water on his own property as long as it looked nice. An idea began forming, one that made him smile for the first time in days. The next morning, Jim called, in sick to work, and headed to the hardware store. He bought decorative rock borders, several sections of plastic drainage pipe, and bags of gravel, all perfectly acceptable landscaping materials according to HOA guidelines. Back at home, he began reworking his yard. To any observer, it looked like he was simply creating an attractive rock garden and fixing some erosion issues. But underneath the decorative surface, Jim was building something entirely different, a system that would channel rainwater more efficiently. Not to collect it this time, but to direct it. Over the next few days, neighbors noticed Jim working in his yard and stopped to chat. When they asked what he was doing, he simply said he was fixing some drainage issues and making his yard HOA compliant. A few of them, like Mr. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez, gave him knowing looks but didn't ask questions. Some even offered to help. By the weekend, Jim's yard looked better than ever. Decorative rock borders lined his garden beds, small gravel paths wound between his plants, and everything looked neat and tidy. There wasn't a rainwater barrel in sight. Debbie drove by slowly on Saturday afternoon, eyeing his property with suspicion. Jim waved cheerfully from where he was planting new flowers near the sidewalk. She didn't wave back, but she couldn't find anything to complain about either. His yard was picture perfect. What Debbie couldn't see was that beneath the attractive surface features, Jim had created a network of channels and pipes. During normal weather, nothing would happen. But during a heavy rainstorm, these hidden channels would direct water from not just his property, but from several nearby yards, whose owners were equally fed up with the HOA's tactics. All that water would flow exactly where gravity wanted it to go, downhill, straight toward the slightly sunken concrete pad where the HOA office sat. The system was perfect in its simplicity. There were no moving parts, no pumps, nothing that could break or be traced back to intentional flooding. It was just rainwater following the path of least resistance, the path it would naturally take if the HOA hadn't interfered with the neighborhood's drainage in the first place. With his work complete, Jim just needed to wait for the right storm. According to the weather forecast, he might not have to wait long. A major system was moving in, promising several inches of rain over the next week. Jim checked his hidden channels one last time, making sure everything was perfect. Then he called his sister in the next state. "Hey Lisa, remember you invited me to come visit last month? Is that offer still open? I could use a break from everything here." The community center was packed for the emergency HOA meeting. Jim arrived a few minutes late, slipping into a seat near the back next to Mr. Chen, who gave him a subtle thumbs up. At the front of the room, Debbie stood with the other board members, looking frazzled and angry. Her usually perfect hair was hastily pulled back, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "As you all know," she began without any greeting, "the HOA office has suffered significant water damage. Initial estimates put the repairs at over $40,000. A murmur went through the crowd. "Our insurance will cover some of it, but we'll likely need a special assessment to make up the difference." The room erupted in protests. Nobody wanted to pay extra fees for something that should have been covered by their regular dues. "What exactly happened?" someone called out. "How did it get so bad?" Debbie's lips thinned to a tight line. According to the initial inspection, there was improper grading around the building, which allowed water to pool and eventually breach the foundation. Additionally, our water management system was overwhelmed by the volume from the storm. Jim had to hide a smile. Water management system. That was a nice way of saying their illegal rainwater collection setup couldn't handle the runoff that his hidden channels had directed straight at them. "Weren't there drainage plans filed before that system was installed?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez innocently. "Shouldn't those have accounted for a heavy storm?" Debbie's face flushed. The system was installed according to proper specifications. This was an unusual weather event that nobody could have predicted. "But the Weather Service issued warnings days in advance," pointed out Mr. Chen. "My brother-in-law works in construction, and he says any drainage system should be built to handle at least twice the expected rainfall for the area." More people began asking questions, their voices growing louder and more insistent. Jim watched as Debbie struggled to maintain control of the meeting, her usual confidence crumbling under the barrage of questions. "What happened to all our records?" someone asked. "My neighbor said the office basement was completely flooded." One of the other board members, a mild-mannered accountant named Bill, cleared his throat nervously. "Unfortunately, many of our paper records were stored in the basement. We've lost quite a bit. The filing cabinets were submerged for nearly 12 hours before the water receded enough for us to access them." This news caused another uproar. People were concerned about property records, architectural approvals, and financial documents being destroyed. "Do we have digital backups?" someone called out. Bill looked even more uncomfortable. "Some things, yes, but our computer system was also damaged when water came through the ceiling and hit the main desk where our server was located." Jim hadn't expected that bit of luck. His channels had been designed to direct water around the foundation, but he hadn't anticipated it would affect their computer systems too. He almost felt bad. Almost. As the meeting continued, the mood in the room shifted. People who had previously been intimidated by Debbie and the board were now asking pointed questions and demanding answers. The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable, especially when someone brought up the fact that the HOA's water collection system had been installed without proper notice to the community. "I think we need to take a closer look at how decisions are being made," said a woman who lived near the community pool. "I didn't even know about this water system until tonight, and now we're all being asked to pay for its failure." Heads nodded throughout the room. Jim stayed quiet, content to watch as the community found its voice. Toward the end of the meeting, Bill the accountant nervously brought up another issue. "There's also the matter of the damage to Wilkins Landscaping's equipment that was stored in the maintenance shed behind the office. Mrs. Wilkins has submitted a claim for those losses as well." A hush fell over the room, followed by whispers. Many people hadn't realized that Debbie's company had equipment stored on HOA property. "Wait," "A minute," said Mr. Chen loudly. "Are you saying the HOA is paying for damages to a private company's equipment? A company owned by the board president?" Debbie rushed to explain. "As the contracted landscaping service, we keep equipment on site for efficiency. It's completely normal and above board." "But isn't that a conflict of interest?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez. "Using HOA property to store your company's equipment, then billing the HOA when it gets damaged?" More questions followed, and Jim could see several people using their phones, presumably looking up rules about HOA governance and conflicts of interest. The meeting that had started as an announcement about flood damage was quickly turning into an examination of Debbie's leadership. After nearly 2 hours, with tension still high, another board member suggested adjourning until they could gather more information about the damages and repair costs. Debbie, looking exhausted and cornered, quickly agreed. As people filed out of the community center, there was none of the usual quiet resignation that followed HOA meetings. Instead, neighbors clustered in small groups, talking animatedly about what they'd learned and what should happen next. Jim walked to his car with Mr. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez, all three trying not to look too pleased with how the evening had unfolded. "Funny how a little water can wash away so many secrets," Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly. "Nature has a way of finding balance," Jim replied with a small smile. "Water always flows downhill eventually." Little did Jim know that the real storm was just beginning, not one of rain and wind, but of community action and long overdue change. The week after the emergency meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with activity. People who had never spoken to each other before were now exchanging phone numbers and meeting for coffee. A neighborhood chat group that had previously been used mostly for lost pet notices and garage sale announcements was now filled with discussions about HOA governance and homeowner rights. Jim found himself at the center of it all, despite his attempts to stay in the background. His neighbors had figured out that his drainage system had played a role in the HOA office flooding, but rather than being angry, many were quietly impressed. A few even asked for advice on how to improve drainage in their own yards. "I'm not advocating for anyone to redirect water," Jim would say carefully. "I just believe in working with the natural flow, not against it." Meanwhile, the HOA office remained closed, with a trailer temporarily set up in the parking lot for urgent business. Debbie was rarely seen, sending other board members to deal with day-to-day matters while she supposedly worked with contractors on the repairs. 10 days. After the flood, Jim received an official-looking envelope in the mail. Inside was a letter from the HOA's attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss drainage modifications to his property. His heart sank. Had they somehow traced the flooding back to his hidden channels? He called Tom from the water department again, for advice. "They can't prove anything," Tom assured him after hearing about the letter. "Your modifications are within code, and they're the ones who altered the natural drainage patterns first without permits. Just play it cool." Jim agreed to the meeting, which was scheduled for the following Monday at the temporary office trailer. The whole weekend, he rehearsed what he would say, preparing for accusations or threats. But when Monday came, he was surprised to find only Bill, the accountant board member, waiting for him. No Debbie, no attorney. "Thanks for coming, Jim," Bill said, looking nervous as usual. "I'll get right to the point. We know what you did with your drainage system." Jim kept his face neutral. "I improved the drainage on my property using HOA-approved materials. It's all within guidelines." Bill gave a small smile. "Yes, it is. Very clever. But we both know those improvements had consequences downhill. Water flows where gravity takes it," Jim said with a shrug. "I didn't install any pumps or artificial diversions." "No, you didn't," Bill agreed. "Just like we didn't file for proper permits before installing our water collection system, or notify homeowners about the drainage changes affecting their properties, or disclose the conflict of interest with Wilkins Landscaping." Jim raised an eyebrow, surprised by Bill's candor. "So what happens now? Am I being fined? Sued?" Bill shook his head. "Neither. I'm here unofficially, actually. There's been a shift in the board. 3 members, including Debbie, have resigned." This was unexpected news. Jim waited for Bill to continue. The insurance inspector found serious issues with how our water collection system was installed. When they started asking questions about permits and engineering approvals, Debbie tried to backdate some documents. Someone in the office, not me, tipped off the insurance company. Jim couldn't help but smile. I imagine they didn't appreciate that. No, they didn't. They're threatening to deny our claim due to negligence and fraud. Between that and the growing homeowner complaints about conflicts of interest, Debbie decided it was best to step down. 2 other board members who were closely aligned with her followed suit. So what happens to the HOA now? Jim asked. We're holding an emergency election next month to fill the vacant positions. In the meantime, those of us remaining on the board are trying to clean up the mess, literally and figuratively. Bill leaned forward. That's why I wanted to talk to you. We're revising the guidelines about rainwater collection. I'd like your input given your expertise in the area. 1 year later, Jim stood in his backyard, proudly looking over his thriving garden. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit, the peppers bright and plentiful, and the cucumber vines sprawled happily along their trellises. His rainwater collection system was back in full operation, but now it was bigger and better than before. 4 large barrels stood neatly against the side of his house, connected to his gutters with efficient piping and feeding into a smart irrigation system that watered his plants exactly when they needed it, and the best part? It was completely HOA approved. In fact, the HOA had helped pay for similar systems for any homeowner who wanted one. Your garden looks amazing, called Mrs. Rodriguez from over the fence. Those tomatoes are twice the size of mine. It's all about the rainwater, Jim said with a smile, picking a ripe tomato and walking over to hand it to her. Have you thought about expanding your collection system? The HOA still has some funds left in the water conservation budget. I might just do that, she replied, taking a bite of the tomato. Oh, that's good. Speaking of the HOA, aren't you late for a meeting? Jim checked his watch. You're right. Better get going. As the newest president of the Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association, Jim had a lot on his plate these days. After the flooding incident and Debbie's resignation, he'd been convinced to run for the board. To his surprise, he'd been elected by a landslide, along with 4 other neighbors who shared his vision for a more transparent and community-focused HOA. Their first official action had been to completely rewrite the regulations on rainwater collection, not only allowing but actively encouraging homeowners to install their own systems. Their second had been to establish a clear conflict of interest policy that prevented board members from awarding contracts to their own businesses. The changes hadn't been easy. Some of the old guard had fought against them, and untangling the mess of Debbie's financial dealings had taken months. But gradually, the community had healed and grown stronger. Jim arrived at the HOA office, fully repaired now, though they'd moved all important records to upper floors and created proper digital backups. The basement had been converted into a community resource center where people could borrow tools, check out books on gardening and home repair, and attend workshops on everything from water conservation to homeowner rights. Sorry I'm a little late, Jim said as he entered the conference room where the other board members were waiting. Got distracted in the garden. No worries, said Bill, who had stayed on as treasurer after proving to be a valuable ally in reforming the HOA. We were just reviewing the budget for the community garden project. The community garden had been Jim's pet project, converting a small unused lot near the neighborhood entrance into a shared garden space where people could grow food and flowers together. It had started small, with just a few raised beds, but had quickly become a neighborhood gathering spot. I think we're ready for phase 2, Jim said, looking over the plans. The rainwater collection system there is working well, but we need more growing space. There's a waiting list for beds now. They spent the next hour discussing plans and budgets, with each board member offering ideas and concerns. Unlike the Yaigao old days, there were no rubber stamps or rushed decisions. Everyone's voice mattered. After the meeting, Jim walked over to check on the community garden. Several people were there, watering plants and pulling weeds. Among them was Mr. Chen, who had become one of the garden's most dedicated volunteers. Jim. Just in time, Mr. Chen called out. We're harvesting the first batch of carrots. Want some? They sat together on a bench near the garden, munching fresh carrots and watching kids run through the newly installed sprinkler that used collected rainwater to create a cooling spray on hot days. You know, I ran into Debbie last week at the grocery store, Mr. Chen said casually. She pretended not to see me, but I said hello anyway. How did she look? Jim asked, genuinely curious. He hadn't seen the former HOA president since she'd moved to a different neighborhood shortly after her resignation. Older. Not happy. I almost felt sorry for her. Mr. Chen shrugged. But then I remembered how she tried to bully everyone and take what wasn't hers. Water under the bridge now, Jim said with a small smile at his own pun. Speaking of water, Mr. Chen said, did you know the city is using our neighborhood as a model for their new water conservation program? The guy from the water department was here yesterday taking pictures of our setup. Jim nodded. Tom mentioned that. They're planning to offer rebates for rainwater collection systems all across the city. All because you were too stubborn to let someone steal your rainwater, Mr. Chen laughed. Jim looked around at the thriving garden, at the children playing, at neighbors chatting as they harvested vegetables together. From his simple act of resistance had grown something he could never have imagined, a true community. Later that evening, as Jim walked home, dark clouds gathered overhead. The familiar scent of rain filled the air, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees lining the street. By the time he reached his house, the first heavy drops were beginning to fall. He stood for a moment in his driveway, face tilted up to the sky, letting the rain wash over him. Then he checked his collection system, making sure everything was working properly. Water flowed smoothly from his gutters into the barrels, not a drop wasted. In the distance, thunder rumbled. Jim smiled. Once, the sound of an approaching storm had filled him with anger and thoughts of revenge. Now it brought only satisfaction and a sense of rightness. The rain would nourish his garden, fill his barrels, and water the community's shared spaces. And whatever excess there was would flow naturally downhill, following the paths he'd created that still remained hidden beneath his beautiful yard, just in case. Some lessons, after all, were worth remembering. Water always finds its way eventually, and sometimes so does justice.